Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic,
Neptune. Cess.
The Doctrine of Essence, which is metaphysics, or the equation, velocity equals the change in place in ratio to the change in time. V equals delta x in ratio or colon delta t. Encyclopedia Section 112. The terms in essence are always mere pairs of correlatives and not yet absolutely reflected in themselves. Hence, in essence, the actual unity of the notion is not realized, but only postulated by reflection. Essence, which is being, coming into mediation with itself through the negativity of itself, is self-relatedness, only insofar as it is relation to an other. This other, however, coming to view at first not as something which is, but as postulated and hypothesized. Being has not vanished, but firstly, essence, as simple self-relation, is being, and secondly, as regards its one-sided characteristic of immediacy, being is deposed to a mere negative, to a seeming or reflected light. Essence accordingly is being, thus reflecting light into itself. The absolute is the essence. This is the same definition as the previous one, that the absolute is being. Insofar as being likewise is simple self-relation, but it is at the same time higher, because essence is being that has gone into itself. That is to say, the simple self-relation in being is expressly put as negation of the negative as immanent self-mediation. Unfortunately, when the absolute is defined to be the essence, the negativity which this implies is often taken only to mean the withdrawal of all determinate predicates. This negative action of withdrawal or abstraction thus falls outside of the essence, which is thus left as a mere result apart from its premises. The Kaput Mortum of abstraction. Kaput Mortum is either deadhead, as Google Translate has it, or death's head. The meaning of Kaput Mortum is the residuum after distillation or sublimation. It also has another definition from colorlex.com. From Latin, caput mortum means death's head. The name goes back to the alchemists who used it for the ultimate remains of an alchemical process, signifying something not changeable and thus worthless. Returning to the text, this negative action of withdrawal or abstraction thus falls outside of the essence, which is thus left as a mere result apparent from its premises, the caput mortum of abstraction. But as this negativity, instead of being external to being, is its own dialectic, the truth of the latter, when seen by the essence, will be being as retired within itself, immanent being. That reflection or light thrown into itself, constitutes the distinction between essence and immediate being, and is the peculiar characteristic of essence itself. Any mention of essence implies that we distinguish it from being. The latter is immediate, and compared with the essence, we look upon it as mere seeming. But this seeming is not an utter non-entity, and nothing at all but being superseded and put by. The point of view given by the essence is in general the standpoint of reflection. This word reflection is originally applied when a ray of light in a straight line impinging upon the surface of a mirror is thrown back from it. In this phenomenon, we have two things. First, an immediate fact, which is, and secondly, the First, an immediate fact, which is, and secondly, the deputed, derivated, or transmitted phase of the same. Something of this sort takes place when we reflect or think upon an object, for here we want to know the object, not in its immediacy, but as derivative or mediated. The problem or aim of philosophy is often represented as the ascertainment of the essence of things, a phrase which only means that things, instead of being left in their immediacy, must be shown to be mediated by or based upon something else. The immediate being of things is thus conceived under the image of a rind or curtain behind which the essence lies hidden. Everything, it is said, has an essence. That is, things really are not what they immediately show themselves. There is therefore something more to be done than merely rove from one quality to another, and merely to advance from qualitative to quantitative, and vice versa. There is a permanent in things, and that permanent is in the first instance their essence. With respect to other meanings and uses of the category of essence, we may note that in the German auxiliary verb sein, S-E-I-N, the past tense is expressed by the term for essence, Wesen, W-E-S-E-N. We designate past being as gewesen, G-E-W-E-S-E-N. This anomaly of language implies to some extent a correct perception of the relation between being and essence. Essence we may certainly regard as past being, remembering, however, meanwhile, that the past is not utterly denied, but only laid aside, and thus at the same time preserved. Thus, to say, Caesar was in Gaul, only denies the immediacy of the event, but not his sojourn in Gaul altogether. That sojourn is just what forms the import of the proposition, in which, however, it is represented as over and gone. Wesen, in ordinary life, frequently means only a collection of aggregate. Zeitungswesen, Zeitungswesen, the press or newspaper business. Postwesen, Postwesen, the post office or postal service. Steuerwesen, the revenue or taxation. All that these terms mean is that the things in question are not to be taken single, in their immediacy, but as a complex, and then perhaps, in addition, in their various bearings. This usage of the term is not very different in its implication for our own. People also speak of finite essences such as man, but the very term essence implies that we have made a step beyond finitude, and the title, as applied to man, is so far inexact. It is often added that there is a supreme essence, being, by which is meant God. On this, two remarks may be made. In the first place, the phrase there is suggests a finite only, as when we say there are many planets, or there are plants of such a constitution and plants of such another. In these cases, we are speaking of something which has other things beyond and beside it. But God, the absolutely infinite, is not something outside and beside whom there are other essences. All else outside of God, if separated from him, possesses no essentiality. In its isolation, it becomes a mere show or seeming, without stay or essence of its own. But secondly, it is a poor way of talking to call God the highest or supreme essence. The category of quantity which the phrase employs has its proper place within the compass of the finite. When we call one mountain the highest of the earth, we have a vision of other high mountains beside it. So too when we call any one the richest or most learned in his country. But God, far from being a being, even the highest, is the being. This definition, however, though such a representation of God is an important and necessary stage in the growth of the religious consciousness, does not by any means exhaust the depth of the ordinary Christian idea of God. If we consider God as the essence only, and nothing more, we know him only as the universal and irresistible power. In other words, as the Lord. Now, the fear of the Lord is doubtless the beginning, but only the beginning of wisdom. To look at God in this light as the Lord, and the Lord alone, is especially characteristic of Judaism and also of Mohammedanism. The defect of these religions lies in their scant recognition of the finite, which, be it as natural things or as finite phases of mind, it is characteristic of the heathen, and as they also for that reason are polytheistic religions to maintain intact. Another not uncommon assertion is that God, as the supreme being, cannot be known. Such is the view taken by modern enlightenment and abstract understanding, which is content to say,
il y a un être suprême. Il y a un être suprême. Il y a un être suprême.
French for there is a supreme being. And there lets the matter rest. To speak thus and treat God merely as the supreme otherworld being implies that we look upon the world before us in its immediacy as something permanent and positive, and forget that true being is just the superseding of all that is immediate. If God be the abstract, supersensible being, outside whom therefore lies all difference and all specific character, he is only a bare name, a mere Kaput Mortum of abstracting understanding. The true knowledge of God begins when we know that things, as they immediately are, have no truth. In reference also to other subjects besides God, the category of essence is often liable to an abstract use, by which, in the study of anything, its essence is held to be something unaffected by and subsisting in independence of its definite phenomenal embodiment. Thus we say, for example, of people that the great thing is not that they do or how they behave, but what they are. This is correct, if it means that a man's conduct should be looked at, not in its immediacy, but only as it is explained by his inner self, and as a revelation of that inner self. Still, it should be remembered that the only means by which the essence and the inner self can be verified is their appearance in outward reality. Whereas the appeal which men make to the essential life as distinct from the material facts of conduct is generally prompted by a desire to assert their own subjectivity and to elude an absolute and objective judgment. Encyclopedia Section 113. Self-relation, in essence, is the form of identity or of reflection into self, which has here taken the place of the immediacy of being. They are both the same abstraction, self-relation. The unintelligence of sense, to take everything limited and finite for being, passes into the obstinacy of understanding, which views the finite as self-identical, not inherently self-contradictory. Encyclopedia paragraph, section 114. This identity, as it has descended from being, appears in the first place only charged with the characteristics of being, and referred to being as to something external. This external being, if taken in separation from the true being of essence, is called the unessential. But that turns out a mistake, because essence is being in self. It is essential only to the extent that it has in itself its negative, reference to another, or mediation. Consequently, it has the unessential as its own proper seeming reflection in itself. But in seeming or mediation there is distinction involved, and since what is distinguished, as distinguished from the identity out of which it arises and in which it is not, or lies as seeming, receives itself the form of identity, the semblance is still in the mode of being, or of self-related immediacy. The sphere of essence thus turns out to be a still imperfect combination of immediacy and mediation. In it, every term is expressly invested with the character of self-relatedness, while yet at the same time one is forced beyond it. It has being, reflected being, a being in which another shows, and which shows in another, and so it is also the sphere in which the contradiction, still implicit in the sphere of being, is made explicit. As the one notion is the common principle underlying all logic, there appears in the development of essence the same attributes or terms as in the development of being, but in a reflex form. Instead of being and not, we have now the forms of positive and negative. The former at first as identity corresponding to pure and uncontrasted being, the latter develops, showing in itself as difference. So also we have becoming represented by the ground of determinate being, which itself, when reflected upon the ground, is existence. The theory of essence is the most difficult branch of logic. It includes the categories of metaphysics and of the sciences in general. These are products of reflective understanding, which, while it assumes the differences to possess a footing of their own, and at the same time also expressly affirms their relativity, still combines the two statements side by side or one after the other by and also without bringing these thoughts into one or unifying them into the notion. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, the Doctrine of Essence, which is metaphysics, or the equation. Velocity equals the change in place in ratio to the change in time. V equals delta x colon delta t. Quasi-subdivision A, essence, as ground of existence. Infra-subdivision A, the pure principles of categories. Infra-subdivision A, the pure principles or categories of reflection. Meta-section alpha. Encyclopedia Section 115. The essence lights up in itself, or its mere reflection, and therefore is only self-relation, not as immediate but as reflected, and that reflex relation is self-identity. This identity becomes an identity in form only, or of the understanding, if it be held hard and fast, quite aloof from difference, or rather abstraction in the imposition of this identity of form, the transformation of something inherently concrete into this form of elementary simplicity. And this may be done in two ways. Either we may neglect a part of the multiple features which are found in the concrete thing, but what is called analysis, and select only one of them, or neglecting their variety, we may concentrate the multiple characters into one. If we associate identity with the absolute, making the absolute the subject of a proposition, we get the absolute is what is identical with itself. However true this proposition may be, it is doubtful whether it be meant in its truth, and therefore it is at least imperfect in the expression, for it is left undecided whether it means the abstract identity of understanding, abstract, that is, because contrasted with the other characteristics of essence, or the identity which is inherently concrete. In the latter case, as will be seen, true identity is first discoverable in the ground, and with a higher notion in the notion. In the latter case, as will be seen, true identity is first discoverable in the ground, and with a higher truth in the notion. Even the word absolute is often used to mean no more than abstract. Absolute space and absolute time, for example, is another way of saying abstract space and abstract time. When the principles of essence are taken as essential principles of thought, they become predicates of a presupposed subject, which, because they are essential, is everything. The propositions thus arising have been stated as universal laws of thought. Thus, the first of them, the Maxim of Identity, reads, everything is identical with itself. A equals A, And negatively, A cannot at the same time be A and not A. This maxim, instead of being a true law of thought, is nothing but the law of abstract understanding. The propositional form itself contradicts it, for a proposition always promises a distinction between subject and predicate, while the while the present one does not fulfill what its form requires. But the law is particularly set aside by the following so-called laws of thought, which make laws out of its opposite. It is asserted that the maxim of identity, though it cannot be proved, regulates the procedure of every consciousness, and that experience shows it to be accepted as soon as its terms are apprehended. To this alleged experience of the logic books may be opposed the universal experience that no mind thinks or forms conceptions or speaks. In accordance with this law, in that no existence of any kind whatever conforms to it, utterances after the fashion of this pretended law: a planet is a planet, magnetism is magnetism, mind is mind, are, as they deserve to be, reputedly silly. That is certainly matter of general experience. The logic which seriously propounds such laws and the scholastic world in which alone they are valid have long been discredited with practical common sense as well as with the philosophy of reason. Identity, in the first place, the repetition of what we had been earlier. Identity, in the first place, the repetition of what we had earlier as being, but as become, through supersession of its character of immediateness. It is therefore being as ideality. It is important to come to a proper understanding of the true meaning of identity, and for that purpose we must especially guard against taking it as abstract identity to the conclusion of all difference. That is the touchstone for distinguishing all bad philosophy from what alone deserves the name of philosophy. Identity in its truth, as an ideality of what immediately is a high category for our religious modes of mind as well as all other forms of thought and mental activity. The true knowledge of God, it may be said, begins when we know Him as identity, as absolute identity. To know so much is to see that all the power and glory of the world sinks into nothing in God's presence, and subsists only as the reflection of His power and His glory. In the same way, identity as self-consciousness is what distinguishes man from nature, particularly from the brutes which never reach the point of comprehending themselves as I, that is, pure self-contained unity. So again, in connection with thought, the main thing is not to confuse the true identity, which contains being and its characteristics ideally transfigured in it, with an abstract identity, identity of bare form, all the changes of narrowness, hardness, meaninglessness, which are so often directed against the thought from the quarter of feeling and immediate perception, rest on the perverse assumption that thought acts only as a faculty of abstract identification. The formal logic itself confirms this assumption by laying down the supreme law of thought, so called, which has been discussed above. If thinking were no more than an abstract identity, we could not but own it to be a most futile and tedious business. No doubt the notion and the idea too are identical with themselves, but identical only in so far as they at the same time involve distinction. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Chapter 8, second subdivision of logic, the doctrine of essence, which is metaphysics, or the equation, velocity equals the change in place in ratio to the change in time, v equals delta x colon delta t. Quasi-subdivision A, essence as ground of existence. Infra-subdivision A, the pure principles or categories of reflection. Meta-section B, difference. Encyclopedia paragraph 116, essence is mere identity and reflection in itself only as it is self-relating negativity, and in that way self-repulsion. It contains therefore essentially the characteristic of difference. Other being is here no longer qualitative, taking the shape of the character or limit. It is now in essence, in self-relating essence, and therefore the negation is at the same time a relation, is in short distinction, relativity, mediation. To ask how identity comes to difference assumes that identity as mere abstract identity is something of itself, and difference also something else equally independent. This supposition renders an answer to the question impossible. If identity is viewed as diverse from difference, all that we have in this way is but difference, and hence we cannot demonstrate the advance to difference, because the person who asks for the how of the progress thereby implies that for him the starting point is non existence. The question then, when put to the test, has obviously no meaning, and its prosperer or proposer may be met with the question what he means by identity, whereupon we should soon see that he attaches no idea to it at all, and that identity is from him an empty name, as we have seen. Besides, identity is undoubtedly a negative, not, however, an abstract, empty not, but the negation of being and its characteristics. Being so, identity is at the same time self reflection, and what is more, negative self relation. In other words, it draws a distinction between it and itself. Encyclopedia paragraph number 117. Difference is, first of all, 1. Immediate difference, in essence, diversity or variety. In diversity, the different things are each individually what they are, and unaffected by the relation in which they stand to each other. This relation is therefore eternal to them. In consequence of the various things thus indifferent to the difference between them, it falls outside them into a third thing, the agent of comparison. This external difference, as an identity of the objects related, is likeness, as a non-identity of them is unlikeness. The gap which understanding allows to divide these characteristics is so great that although comparison has one and the same substratum for likeness and unlikeness, which are explained to be different aspects and points of view in it, still likeness by itself is the first of the elements alone when seen as identity, and unlikeness by itself is difference. Diversity has, like identity, been transformed into a maxim. Everything is various or different, or there are no two things completely like each other. Here, everything is put under a predicate, which is the reverse of the identity attributed to it in the first maxim. and therefore under a law contradicting the first. However, there is an explanation, as the diversity is supposed due only to external comparison. Anything taken per se is expected and understood always to be identical with itself, so that the second law need not interfere with the first. But in that case, variety does not belong to something or everything in question. It constitutes no intrinsic characteristic of the subject, and the second maxim on this showing does not admit of being started at all. If, on the other hand, the something itself is, as the maxim says, diverse, it must be in virtue of its own proper character, but in this case the specific difference and not variety as such is what is intended, and this is the meaning of the maxim of Leibniz. When understanding sets itself to study identity, it has already passed beyond it, and is looking at difference in the shape of bare variety. If we follow the so-called law of identity and say the sea is the sea, the air is the air, the moon is the moon, these objects pass for having no bearing on one another. What we have before us, therefore, is not identity, but difference. We do not stop at this point, however, or regard things merely as different. We compare them one with another, and thus discover the features of likeness and unlikeness. The work of the finite sciences lies to a great extent in the application of these categories, and the phrase scientific treatment generally means no more than the method which has for its aim comparison of the objects under examination. This method has undoubtedly led to some important results. We may particularly mention the great advance of modern times in the provinces of comparative anatomy and comparative linguistics, but it is going too far to suppose that the comparative method can be employed with equal success in all branches of knowledge, nor, and this must be emphasized, can mere comparison ever ultimately satisfy the requirements of science? It results, its results are indeed indispensable, but they are still labors only primarily, pardon, its results are indeed indispensable, but they are still labors only preliminarily to truly intelligent cognition. I'll start over. But it is going too far to suppose that the comparative method can be employed with equal success in all branches of knowledge, nor, and this must be emphasized, can mere comparison ever ultimately satisfy the requirements of science. Its results are indeed indispensable, but they are still labors only preliminary to truly intelligent cognition. If it be the office of comparison to reduce existing differences to identity, the science which most perfectly fulfills that end is mathematics. The reason of that is that quantitative difference is only the difference which is quite external. Thus, in geometry, a triangle and a quadrangle figures qualitatively differently. Thus, in geometry, a triangle and a quadrangle, figures qualitatively different, have this qualitative difference discounted by abstraction and are equalized to one another in magnitude. It follows from what has been formerly said about the mere identity of understanding that, as has been pointed out in Encyclopedia, paragraph 99, and the rest of it beyond the outline, Neither philosophy nor the empirical sciences need envy this superiority of mathematics. The story is told that when Leibniz propounded the maxim of variety, the cavaliers and ladies of the court, as they walked around the garden, made efforts to discover two leaves indistinguishable from each other in order to confute the laws stated by the philosopher. Their device was unquestionably a convenient method of dealing with metaphysics, one which has not ceased to be fashionable. All the same, as regarded the principle of Leibniz, difference must be understood to mean not an external and indifferent diversity merely, but difference essential. Hence, the very nature of things implies that they must be different. Encyclopedia paragraph 118, likeness is an identity only of those things which are not the same, not identical with each other, and unlikeness is a relation of things unlike. The two, therefore, do not fall on different aspects or points of view in the thing without any mutual affinity, but one throws light into the other. Variety thus comes to be reflexive, difference, or difference, distinction, implicit and essential, determinate or specific difference. While things merely various show themselves unaffected by each other, likeness and unlikeness, on the contrary, are a pair of characteristics which are in completely reciprocal relation. The one of them cannot be thought without the other. This advance from simple variety to opposition appears in our common acts of thought when we allow that comparison has a meaning only upon the hypothesis of an existing difference, and that on the other hand we can distinguish only on the hypothesis of existing similarity. Hence, if the problem be the discovery of a difference, we attribute no great cleverness to the man who only distinguishes those objects of which the difference is palpable. Ergo, a pen and a camel. And similarly, it implies no very advanced faculty of comparison when the objects compared, ergo, a beech and an oak, a temple and a church, are near akin. In the case of difference, in short, we like to see identity, and in the case of identity, we like to see difference. Within the range of the empirical sciences, however, the one of these two categories is often allowed to put the other out of sight and mind. Thus, the scientific problem at one time is to reduce existing differences to identity. On another occasion, with equal one-sidedness, to discover new differences. We see this especially in physical science. There, the problem consists in the first place in the continual search for new elements, new forces, new genera and species. Or in another direction, it seeks to show that all bodies hitherto believed to be simple are compound. And modern physicists and chemists smile at the ancients who were satisfied with four elements, and these not simple. Secondly, and on the other hand, mere identity is made the chief question, thus electricity and chemical affinity are regarded as the same, and even the organic processes of digestion and assimilation are looked upon as mere chemical operation. Modern philosophy has often been nicknamed philosophy of identity. But as was already remarked in paragraph 103 and that which followed it, it is precisely philosophy, and in particular speculative logic, which lays bare the nothingness of the abstract, undifferentiated identity known to understanding, though it also undoubtedly urges the disciples not to rest at mere diversity, but to attain the inner unity of all existence. Encyclopedia Section 119, or Encyclopedia Paragraph 119. Difference implicit is essential difference, the positive and the negative, and that is this way. The positive is the identical self relation in such a way as not to be the negative, and the negative is the difference by itself so as not to be the positive. Thus, either has an existence of its own in proportion as it thus each thus either has an existence of its own in proportion as it is not the other. The one is made visible in the other and is only insofar as that other is. Essential difference is therefore opposition, according to which the different is not confronted by any other but by its other. That is, either of these two, positive and negative, is stamped with a characteristic of its own only in relation to the other. The one is only reflected into itself as it is reflected into the other, and so with the other. Either in this way is the other's own other. Either in this way is the other's own other. Difference, implicit or essential, gives the maxim, everything is essentially distinct, or as it has always been expressed, of two opposite predicates, the one only can be assigned to anything, and there is no third possible. This maxim of contrast or opposition must expressly controverse this maxim of contrast or opposition most expressly controverts the maxim of identity. The one says a thing should be only self-relation, the other says that it must be an opposite, a relation to its other. The native unintelligence of abstraction betrays itself by setting in juxtaposition two contrary maxims, like these, as laws, without even so much as comparing them. The maxim of excluded middle is the maxim of the definite understanding, each with which would fain avoid contradiction, but in so doing falls into it. A must be positive A or negative A, it says. It virtually declares in these words a third A which is neither positive nor negative, at which at the same time is yet invested with positive and negative characters. If positive W means 6 miles to the west and negative W means 6 miles to the east, and if positive and negative cancel each other, the 6 miles of way or space remain what they were with and without the contrast. Even the mere plus and minus of number or abstract direction have, if we like, zero as their third. But I but it need not be denied that the empty contrast which understanding institutes between plus and minus is not without its value in such abstractions as number, direction, and the like. In the doctrine of contradictory concepts, the one notion is, say, blue, for in this doctrine even the sensuous generalized image of a color is called a notion, and the other not blue, this other then would not be an affirmative, say yellow, but would merely be kept at the abstract negative, that the negative in its own nature is quite as much positive, see next paragraph, is implied in saying that what is opposite to another is its other. The inanity of the opposition between what are called contradictory notions is fully exhibited in what we may call the grandiose formula of a general law, that everything has the one and not the other of all predicates which are in such opposition. In this way, mind is either white or not white, yellow or not yellow, and so on ad infinitum. It was forgotten that identity and opposition are themselves opposed, and the maxim of opposition, which, taken even for that of identity, in the shape of the principle of contradiction, a notion which possesses neither or both of two mutually contradictory marks, ergo a quadrangle circle, is held to be logically false. Now, though a multangular circle and a rectilineal arc no less contradict this maxim. Geometers never hesitate to treat the circle as a polygon with rectilineal sides. So I'll go back. Now, though a multangle circle and a rectilineal arc no less contradict this maxim, geometers never hesitate to treat the circle of a polygon with rectilineal sides, but anything like a circle, that is to say its mere character or nominal difference, is still no notion. On the notion of a circle, center and circumference are equally essential. Both marks belong to it. And yet center and circumference are opposite and contradictory to each other. The conception of polarity, which is so dominant in physics, contains by implication the more correct definition of opposition. But physics, for its theory of the laws of thought, adheres to the ordinary logic. It might well it might therefore well be horrified in case it should ever work out the conception of polarity and get at the thoughts which are implied in it. 1. With the positive, we return to identity, but in its higher truth as identical self relation, and at the same time with the note that it is not the negative. The negative per se is the same as difference itself. The identical as much is primarily the yet uncharacterized. The positive, of the other hand, is what is self identical, but with the mark of antithesis to the other. And the negative is difference as such, characterized as not identity. This is the difference of difference within its own. Positive and negative are supposed to express an absolute difference. The two, however, are at bottom the same. The name of either might be transferred to the other. Thus, for example, debts and assets are not two particular, self-subsisting species of property. What is negative to the debtor is positive to the creditor. A way to the east is also a way to the west. Positive and negative are therefore intrinsically conditioned by one another and are only in relation to each other. The north pole of the magnet cannot be without the south pole, and vice versa. If we cut a magnet in two, we have not a north pole in the piece and a south pole in the other. Similarly, in electricity, the positive and the negative are not two diverse and independent fluids. In opposition, the different is not confronted by any other, but by its other. Usually we regard different things as unaffected by each other. Thus we say, I am a human being, and around me are air, water, animals, and all sorts of things. Everything is thus put outside of every other. But the aim of philosophy is to banish indifference and to ascertain the necessity of things. By that means, the other is seen to stand over against its other. Thus, for example, inorganic nature is not to be considered merely something else than organic nature, but the necessary antithesis of it. Both are in essential relation to one another. And the one of the two is only insofar as it excludes the other from it, and thus relates itself thereto. Nature, in like manner, is not without mind, nor mind without nature. An important step has been taken when we cease in thinking to use phrases like, of course something else is also possible. While we so speak, we are still tainted with contingency, and all true thinking, we have already said, is a thinking of necessity. In modern physical science, the opposition first observed to exist in magnetism as polarity has come to be regarded as a universal law pervading the whole of nature. This would be a real scientific advance if care were at the same time taken not to let mere variety revert without explanation as a valid category side by side with opposition. Thus, at one time, the colors are regarded as in polar opposition to one another and called complementary colors. At another time, they are looked at in their indifferent and merely quantitative difference of red, yellow, green, and so on. 2. Instead of speaking by the maxim of excluded middle, which is the maxim of abstract understanding, we should rather say, everything is opposite, neither in heaven nor in earth, neither in the world of mind nor of nature, is there anything such as abstract either or, as the understanding maintains. Whatever exists is concrete with difference and opposition in itself. The finitude of things will then lie in the want of correspondence between their immediate being and what they essentially are. Thus, in inorganic nature, the acid is implicitly at the same time the base. In other words, its only being consists in its relation to its other. Hence, also, the acid is not something that persists quietly in the contrast. It is always an effort to realize what it potentially is. Contradiction is the very moving principle of the world, and it is ridiculous to say that contradiction is unthinkable. The only thing correct in that statement is that contradiction is not the end of matter. The only thing correct in that statement is that contradiction is not the end of the matter, but cancels itself. But contradiction, when canceled, does not leave abstract identity, for that is itself only one side of the contrariety. The proximate result of opposition, when realized as contradiction, is the ground, which contains identity as well as difference, superseded and deposed two elements in the completer notion. Encyclopedia, paragraph 120. Contrariety then has two forms. The positive is the aforesaid various difference, which is understood to be so actually also, since either is the abrogation of the other and of itself, thus they may fall to the ground, or as is plain the essential difference as a difference is only the difference of it from itself, and thus contains the identical, so that to essential and actual difference there belongs itself as well as identity. As self-relating difference, it is likewise virtually enunciated as the self-identical. And the opposite is, in general, that which includes the one and its other, itself and its opposite. The immanence of essence, thus defined, is the ground. It is almost the year 119 after the Cairo Revelation by Sir Edward Alexander Crowley, often called Alistair. The sun, Sol, is in 20 degrees Cancer. The moon, Luna, is in 5 degrees Capricorn. Dies Martes, the day is Wednesday, July 12th, 2022, of the Vulgar era, Era Vulgaris, or of the Vulgar era, 11:33:59 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do what thy wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. It is 1 minute before the planetary hour of the moon, thus it is the planetary hour of Mercury. Source for this information, CAL 93, an application I've downloaded from online. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, the Doctrine of Essence, which is metaphysics, or the equation velocity equals the change in place in ratio to the change in time, v equals delta x colon delta t, quasi-subdivision A, essence as ground of existence, Infra-subdivision A, the pure principles or categories of reflection. Metasection Gamma, the ground. Encyclopedia, paragraph 121. The ground is the unity of identity and difference, the truth of what difference and identity have turned out to be, the reflection into self, which is equally a reflection into an other, and vice versa. It is essence put explicitly as a totality. The maxim of the ground runs thus: everything has its sufficient ground, that is, the true essentiality of anything is not the predication of it as identical with itself, or as different, various, or merely positive, or merely negative, but as having its being in an other, which, being itself same, is its essence. And to this extent, the essence is not abstract reflection into self, but into an other. The ground is the essence of its own inwardness. The essence is intrinsically a ground, and it is a ground only when it is a ground of somewhat of an other. We must be careful. We must be careful when we say that the ground is the unity of identity and difference, not to understand by this unity an abstract identity. Otherwise, we only change the nature while we still think the identity of understanding already seen to be false. To avoid this misconception, we may say that the ground, besides being the unity, is also the difference of identity and difference. In that case, in the ground, which promised at first to supersede contradiction, a new contradiction seems to arise. It is, however, a contradiction which, so far from persisting quietly in itself, it rather the expulsion of it from itself. The ground is a ground only to the extent that it affords ground. But the result which thus issued from the ground is only itself. In this lies its formalism. The ground and what is grounded are one and the same content. The difference between the two is the mere difference of form, which separates simple self-relation on the one hand from mediation or derivation or derivativeness on the other. Again, the ground and what is grounded are one and the same content. The difference between the two is the mere difference of form, which separates simple self-relation on the one hand from mediation or derivativeness on the other. Inquiry into the grounds of things goes with the point of view which, as already noted, the note after Encyclopedia paragraph 112. The note is, so you have the first paragraph, which is being numbered. So go to Encyclopedia Section 121, for instance, or it'll just say Section 121. And then you'll see the first paragraph. And that is the paragraph being referenced. Everything else under it is a note to it. Rarely will you find a separate note until you get to the later sections. And so my outlining method is to take the first paragraph that's named in those sections, so Encyclopedia Section or Encyclopedia paragraph 121, the ground is the unity of identity and difference, and then I'll leave that for what I've outlined, and that's how I get a narrative later, which I'm going to read as what's called a hashia in Arabic, but a summary, a professional summary of the text. Though underneath, within the notes, you'll also find subcategories, and that's what I call infra or meta or the other things. There are subcategories within it that in a kind of in a ladder uh, gets more and more complicated and diminished, smaller and smaller, and more specific within that whole group. And so, if you're following along with the outline, this is how I outline it. This is how I learned to outline it from Professor Victor Wittgenstein, a professor of political science, specifically for me, political theory, and also a psychotherapist, and at UCLA, this is the general style of outlining. Take the first paragraph of a section, and I'm learning, going further from that, to also look within a section and see if it's been further subdivided. And either if there's no subdivision, just keep that first paragraph and move on. You'll get the overwhelming majority of what you'll need to write about if you're writing or just to understand it. So you take the first paragraph within a section, section 121, and then you look through the section to see if there's any more subdivisions. A subdivision would be have a letter like an A or a Greek letter alpha. So a Latin letter A, Greek letter alpha. It'll also possibly have a number. And then there are different types of these sections. Some of them are more important than the others. Some hold others within it. So if you think about a file folder within well, I would say overwhelmingly within the Microsoft environment, you have a file folder open, or if you're using Google Files, file folder open. Within that folder, you'll have other files folders as well, and you may have open files on their own. So say you click into the file folder, there'll be more documents. But if you click into the Word file, in the Word file, there may be uh, graphs and things there too. So they have different types of subcategories, and some are more efficient than the others. So this is how I'm outlining. If you have to read a book and try to figure out how you're ever going to remember it, one, I recommend getting a Kindle reader. In the Kindle reader, you'll highlight a whole area, and then it'll tell you where you were in your particular reader as a reference text. And so you can take that paragraph, or having some other, and Kindle Reader has a version of itself on the internet where you can go into instead of using your telephone or an app, you can go directly to Amazon.com and read books that you've purchased in your browser. And this kind of gives a easier way to copy and paste them. Okay, I'm going to read through Gamma again. So Gamma, the ground, Encyclopedia Section, or Encyclopedia paragraph 121. The ground is the unity of identity and difference, the truth of what difference and identity have turned out to be, the reflection into self, which is equally a reflection into an other, and vice versa. It is essence put explicitly as a totality. The maxim of the ground runs thus: everything has its sufficient ground. That is, the true essentiality of anything is not the predication of it as identical with itself, or as different, various, or merely positive, or merely negative, but as having its being in an other, which being its self same is its essence. And to this extent, the essence is not abstract reflection into itself, but into an other. The ground is the essence in its own inwardness. The essence is intrinsically a ground, and it is a ground only. When it is a ground of somewhat of another, we must be careful. When we say that the ground is the unity of identity and difference, not to understand by this unity an abstract identity, otherwise we only change the name while we still think the identity of understanding already seen to be false. To avoid this misconception, we may say that the ground, besides being the unity, is also the difference of identity and difference. In that case, in the ground, which promised to first, in that case, in the ground, which promised at first to supersede contradiction, a new contradiction seems to arise. It is, however, a contradiction which, so far from persisting quietly in itself, is rather the expulsion of it from itself. The ground is a ground only to the extent that it affords ground, but the result which thus issued from the ground is only itself. In this lies its formalism. The ground and what is grounded are one and the same content. The difference between the two is the mere difference of form, which separates simple self-relation on the other hand from mediation or derivativeness on the other. Inquiry into the grounds of things goes with the point of view which, as already noted, the note to paragraph section 112, is adopted by reflection. We wish, as it were, to see the matter double, first in its immediacy and secondly in its ground, where it is no longer immediate. Thus is the plain meaning of the law of sufficient ground, as it is called. It asserts that things should be essentially it asserts that things should essentially be viewed as mediated. The manner in which formal logic establishes this law of thought sets a bad example to other sciences. Formal logic asks these sciences not to accept their subject matter as it is immediately given, and yet herself lays down a law of thought without deducing it, in other words, without exhibiting its mediation. With the same justice as the logician maintains our faculty of thought to be so constituted that we must ask for the ground of everything, might the physicist, when asked why a man who falls into water is drowned, reply that man happens to be so organized that he cannot live underwater? Or the jurist, when asked why a criminal is punished, reply that civil society happens to be so constituted that crimes cannot be left unpunished? Yet even if logic be excused the duty of giving a ground for the law of the sufficient ground, it might at least explain what is to be understood by a ground. The common explanation which describes the ground as what has a consequence seems at the first glance more lucid and intelligible than the preceding definition in logical terms. If you ask, however, what the consequence is, you are told that it is what has a ground, and it becomes obvious that the explanation is intelligible only because it assumes what in our case has been reached as the termination of an antecedent movement of thought, and this is the true business of logic, to show that those thoughts which as usually employed merely float before consciousness, neither understood nor demonstrated, are really grades in the self-determination of thought. It is by this means that they are understood and demonstrated. In common life, and it is the same in the finite sciences, this reflective form is often employed as a key to the secret of the real condition of the object under investigation. So long as we deal with what may be termed the household needs of knowledge, nothing can be urged against this method of study. But it can never afford definite satisfaction, either in theory or practice, and the reason why it fails is that the ground is yet without a definite content on its own. So that to regard anything resting upon a ground merely gives the formal difference of mediation in place of immediacy. We see an electrical phenomenon, for example, and we ask for its ground or reason. We are told that electricity is the ground of this phenomenon. What is this but the same content as we had immediately before us, only translated into the form of inwardness? The ground, however, is not merely simple self-identity, but also difference. Hence, various grounds may be alleged for the same sum of fact. This variety of grounds, again, following the logic of difference, culminates in opposition of grounds pro and contra. In any action such as a theft, there is a sum of fact in which several aspects may be distinguished. The theft has violated the rights of property. It has given the means of satisfying his wants to the needy thief, possibly to the man from whom the theft was made, misused his property. The violation of property is unquestionably the decisive point of view before which the others must give way. But the bare law of the ground cannot settle the question. Usually, indeed, the law is interpreted to speak of a sufficient ground, not of any ground whatever, and it might be supposed, therefore, in the action referred to, that although other points of view besides the violation of property might be held as grounds, yet they would not be sufficient grounds. But here comes a dilemma. If we use the phrase sufficient ground, the epithet is either is either odious, serving no practical purpose or result, or of such a kind as to carry us past the mere category of ground. The predicate is odious and tautological if it only states the capability of giving a ground or reason, for the ground is a ground only in so far as it has this capability. If a soldier runs away from battle to save his life, his conduct is certainly a violation of duty, but it cannot be held that the ground which led him so to act was insufficient. Otherwise, we would have remained at it. Otherwise, he would have had. If a soldier runs away from battle to save his life, his conduct is certainly a violation of duty. But it cannot be held that the ground which led him so to act was insufficient, otherwise he would have remained at his post. Besides, there is this also to be said: on one hand, any ground suffices; on the other, no ground suffices as mere ground, because, as already said, it is yet void of content, objectively and intrinsically determined, and is therefore not self-acting and productive. A content thus objectively and intrinsically determined, and hence self-acting, will hereafter come before us as the notion, and it is the notion which Leibniz had in his eye when he spoke of sufficient ground, and urged the study of things under its point of view. His remarks were originally directed against that merely mechanical method of conceiving things so much in vogue even now, a method which he justly pronounces insufficient. We may see an instance of this mechanical theory of investigation when the organic process of the circulation of the blood is traced back merely to contradiction of the heart, or when certain theories of criminal law explain the purpose of punishment to lie in deterring people from crime, in rendering the criminal harmless, or in other extraneous grounds of the same kind. It is unfair to Leibniz to suppose that he was content with anything so poor as this formal law of the ground. The method of investigation which he inaugurated is the very reverse of a formalism which acquiesces in mere grounds. Where a full and concrete knowledge is sought, considerations to this effect led Leibniz to contrast
Causae efficienits and causae finales. Causae efficienits and causae finales. Causae efficienits and causae finales.
efficient causes and final causes by Google Translate, and to insist in the place of final causes as the conception to which the efficient were to lead up. If we adopt this distinction, light, heat, and moisture would be the causae efficientes, not the causae finalis of the growth of plants. The causae finalis is the notion of the plant itself. To get no further than mere grounds, especially on questions of law and morality, is the position and principle of the sophists. Sophistry, as we ordinarily conceive it, is a method of investigation which aims at distorting what is just and true, exhibiting things in a false light. Such, however, is not the proper or primary tendency of sophistry, the standpoint of which is no other than that of Zenemo, reasoning. The Sophists came on the scene at a time when the Greeks had begun to grow dissatisfied with mere authority and tradition, and felt the need of intellectual justification for what they were to accept as obligatory. The Desideretum the Sophists apply by teaching their countrymen to seek for the various points of view under which things may be considered, which points of view are the ground, same as grounds. But the ground, as we have seen, has no essential and objective principles of its own, and it is as easy to discover grounds for what is wrong and immoral as for what is moral and right. Upon the observer, therefore, it depends to decide what points are to have most weight. The decision in such circumstances is prompted by his individual views and sentiments. Thus, the objective foundation of what ought to have been absolute and essential obligation, accepted by all, was undermined, and sophistry by this destructive action deservedly brought upon itself the bad name previously mentioned. Socrates, as we all know, met the sophists at every point, not by a bare reassertion of authority and tradition against their argumentations, but by showing dialectically how untenable the mere grounds were, and by vindicating the obligation of justice and goodness, by reinstating the universal or notion of the will. In the present day, such a method of argumentation is not quite out of fashion. Nor is that the case only in the discussion of secular matters. It occurs even in sermons, such as those where every possible ground of gratitude to God is propounded. To such pleading Socrates and Plato would not have sculpted, to such pleading Socrates and Plato would not have scrupled to apply the name of sophistry, for sophistry has nothing to do with what is taught that may be possibly true. Sophistry lies in the formal circumstances of teaching it by grounds which are as available for attack as for defense. In a time so rich in reflection and so devoted to raisonnement, or reasoning, as our own, he must be a poor creature who cannot advance a good ground for everything, even for what is worse than most depraved. Everything in the world that has become corrupt has had good ground for its corruption, and appeal to grounds at first makes the hearer think of beating a retreat. But when experience has taught him the real state of these matters, he closes his ears against them and refuses to be imposed upon any more. Encyclopedia, paragraph 122. As it first comes, the chief feature of essence is show in itself and intermediation in itself. But when it has completed the circle of intermediation, its unity with itself is explicitly put as the self annulling of difference, or the self annulling of difference, the self annulling, pardon, Encyclopedia, paragraph 122. As it first comes, the chief feature of essence is show in itself and intermediation in itself. But when it has completed the circle of intermediation, its unity with itself is explicitly put as the self annulling of difference, and therefore of intermediation. Once more, then we come back to the immediacy of being, but being is so far as it is intermediated by annulling the intermediation, and that being is existence. The ground is not yet determined by objective principles of its own, nor is it an end or final cause. Hence, it is not active nor productive, and existence only proceeds from the ground. The determinate ground is therefore a formal matter. That is to say, any point will do, so long as it is expressly put as self-relation, as affirmation, in correlation with the immediate existence depending on it. If it be a ground at all, it is a ground. If it be a ground at all, it is a good ground, for the term good is employed abstractly as equivalent to affirmative, and any point or feature is good which can in any way be enunciated as confessedly affirmative. So it happens that a ground can be found and adduced for everything, and a good ground, for example, a good motive for action, may effect something or may not. It may have a consequence or it may not. It becomes a motive strictly so called and effects something, ergo, through its reception into a will, there and there only it becomes active and is made a cause. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So at the end of this, the question is, why are we trying to find a motive, a good motive for everything? We are trying to say, instead of saying the person attacked, so the black American attacked the Asian American because of racism, a negative view of the Black American for the Asian American, instead of saying the Black American attacked the Asian American because of a philosophical difference in which the Black American was correct. We may say it was wrong for him to have attacked the Asian person, but the grounds upon which he attacked were correct. Now, what were they correct about? They were just correct objectively. Their correctness did not imply that another person be attacked who held a different view. But it is not unusual that when you have a correct notion, just objectively correct, that you may decide instead of trying to prove it to someone, you take physical violence against them for not having that correct notion as well. And we can find a positive or a good reason, a good motive for every single action. It doesn't mean that the action itself is cognized by the law or morality to be a good response. So I have a good feeling that I am right about a subject, but it may not be moral for me to impose that right on others, even if it may mean that the others are in some way uh, delayed in their progress. It would be better to have them delayed in their progress than to harm them with the information or to harm them physically because I'm correct. Otherwise, if I just leave it the way it is, someone could run off with that and cause quite a bit of damage. And I think they have in the past. So be careful with Encyclopedia Section 122. Read it again and again. And if you were teaching it, provide some explanation as I have. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, the Doctrine of Essence, which is metaphysics, or the equation, velocity equals the change in place in ratio to the change in time, v equals delta x colon delta t, quasi-subdivision A, essence as ground of existence, infra-subdivision B, existence. Encyclopedia paragraph 123,